Unit 9, Necessity, Processes and Implementation of Risk Assessment. Okay, we've been discussing the risk assessment throughout the rest of the previous chapters, so today we will actually look at some examples and go through it. So what are the outcomes of this chapter or unit? Understand the reasons why risk assessments are necessary, identify the steps involved, outline the key risk assessment principles, discuss various risk assessment tools, list the measures used to control the risks, and discuss the roles of data collection and record keeping. Okay, so a risk assessment. It is imperative of employers to recognize, identify, and control hazards within the workplace. And this is done through the implementation of a risk assessment. Simply put, you're taking a walk, you see at your job site that there is a excavation in the middle of your work site, and it comes with additional hazards. Now, instead of talking about it and verbally discussing it, you're actually going to put those words onto a formal document, and that document is called a risk assessment. Okay. Now, the necessity for a risk assessment. Before you understand the necessity, you need to know what the definition is. So what is a risk? Okay. Previously, we discussed that a risk comes from the identified hazard. We identify a hazard, and a hazard then comes with associated risks. For example, the hazard could be working at heights. What are the risks associated with working at heights? It could be falling from heights, okay? Collapsing of a scaffold, all right? The risk is a situation that is related to the hazard identified. For example, the excavation. What are the risks related to the excavation? Falling into the excavation, okay? It could even be confined space, depending on the depth of the excavation. Okay. So then what is a risk assessment? It is a formal document that states your hazards, states the risks associated with this hazard, identifies the risk level, okay, and puts down the controls to minimize the impact of the risks, okay? The document is there as evidence that you've analyzed your hazards and risks, and you know what their level of likelihood or exposure or consequences will be if you are exposed to it, and how are you going to go about minimizing and eliminating those exposures and impacts. Okay, it is very important to have a risk assessment on site. It is your evidence, portfolio of evidence, that you know what is related to your site and how you're going to ensure that you have a safe working environment. Okay, so risk assessment processes. There are 3 basic conditions related to the risk assessment process. Okay, here it is, source of the risk. Okay, and that comes from your activity, your exposure level. Okay, and that is what is the existing danger and what is the causal process. For example, what is going to happen if you are exposed to the risk. That is how you identify your risks. Okay, your activity, working at heights. Okay, exposure level, falling from heights. What is actually going to happen? What is the exposure consequence? You're going to either die if you fall from heights, depending on the height, or you're going to sprain your head or have a concussion. Okay. So, when we are developing our risk assessment, these are the 5 steps you will follow. Okay, and this is what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the 5 risk assessment process steps, and then I am going to show you an example of a risk assessment. Okay, and a matrix. Okay, so you identify the risks. Step 1, identifying the hazard. Okay. Identify the hazard. You cannot identify your risks without first identifying your hazard. So you identify your hazard. Okay, how do we go about identifying our hazards? We talk to our employees. We talk to our construction managers. We talk to our construction supervisors. It comes from experience. what is related to that industry, okay, in statistics wise. Okay, what is legislation requirements stating? Okay, we go through documentation of previous jobs we've done. Okay, similar to that job, what hazards were we exposed to then? Okay, you will notice that you always use a repeat of the same hazards in your previous and current jobs. They are always related. You always have similar, for example, pinch point or ergonomics, okay, as hazards. So what is our exposure to the hazard? Okay, step 2. Now, the way we go about identifying our exposure is by looking at the conditions, okay? How are we going to be exposed to it? How are we going to identify the impact that it might have on us? Okay, and this is done by understanding what work processes you are doing. Okay, what machinery are you going to be using? If you're going to be using high-risk machinery, for example, a banding saw, I think it's called, or a band saw, a circular saw, that possesses a high risk of exposure to finger cuts or even finger amputations. Why? Because your fingers and hands are very close to the blades when operating it. Okay, so the exposure level will come from your activities and what type of tools and equipment you will be using and the environment you will be working in. Okay, for example, if you're working on the fuel terminal sites and you're working at the fuel tanks, you're going to have high exposure to fuel levels and gases. Okay, which means if you're using hot work tools such as drilling machines, welding machines in a fuel and gas terminal tank farm, you're going to be exposed to an ignition, fire. Okay, if you do not have the correct mitigations and tools in place to ensure safety. Okay, so step 3, evaluate the hazards and its preventions. Okay, so now you know what your hazards are, you know what your risks are associated to those hazards. Now we actually need to evaluate them. Okay, here we must categorize the hazards and associate the risks to determine the likelihood. So you will then say working at heights as your hazard on your risk assessment. You will then state all the risks associated to working at heights. They must all be categorized together. Once that is done, you can then determine your likelihood and exposure level. What are the consequences, okay, for that specific hazard and associated risk? And the way we go about determining the initial risk level is by looking at a risk matrix. Okay, there is a basic matrix that is used, but remember there are so many different methodologies that can be used at the different companies. Okay, so we will first identify our initial risk before any controls have been put in place. What is the raw risk of being exposed to this this hazard and risk associated? Okay, and this is an example of the risk matrix you can use to identify the risk level exposure. It is a calculation, okay? Depending on what methodology you use, it will identify it as extremely high, high, medium, or low. Okay. And when we talk about a level of hazard and risk at a low level, it means that there will be minor injuries. For example, maybe a finger cut, first aid injury. Okay. Extremely high, that means extremely high cost or loss of life. So example, extremely high, working at heights, maybe 10 meters at height, you fall from height, you die. That would be an extremely high risk level. Okay. So that is how you will then categorize. And a lot of risk assessments categorize using color coding, where green means it's low risk level and extremely high means red. Okay, and high means orange and medium is yellow. You can categorize in different colors as well to identify. Okay. So what is step 4? Record the risk assessment findings. So you conduct your risk assessment. You then do your initial raw risk. What is it? High level, medium, extremely high. We don't want it to be ever extremely high. And if, excuse me, then you will identify what controls we can put in place to minimize our exposure, minimize the consequences related to that risk and hazard. Okay, and I will give you some examples shortly. Okay. Then the last step, review and update your risk assessment. Now remember, you don't just do your risk assessment at the beginning of your job and you leave it. It doesn't work like that. Why? Because the environment changes every day. Okay, maybe not your tools and equipment that you're using, maybe you're using the same tools and equipment every day, but the environmental changes can take place. For example, maybe yesterday it was 40 degrees outside with the heat, and tomorrow it's going to be flood rain, or it's going to be gale force winds. Okay, that will determine certain hazards and risk. Weather is its own hazard on its own, and you always need to put that into your risk assessment. Okay, heat, rain, and wind. Why? Because you are not allowed to work at heights when it is over 45 kilometers per hour. Okay, you cannot be working in heat at 50 degrees. Okay, in a full head to toe body overall. Why? You are going to put yourself at risk for major bodily injuries. Okay, dehydration. Okay, falling off the scaffold, wind, falling off the scaffold again, slipping and falling. It produces its own risks and consequences with the weather. So it is always important that we update and review our risks every day. Okay. If it is just your baseline risk assessment, for example, for your office or for your kitchen in your office, you can do those every 6 months. But I do recommend that your tasks that you're doing that are high risk should be reviewed every day and discussed every day in your toolbox talk. Okay, so now how do we go about controlling and mitigating these risks associated to the hazards? Well, there are 3 major controls. Okay, and those controls come with its own set of activities to mitigate. Okay, but we can categorize the 3 main headings as engineering controls, operational measures, and managing supervision controls. Okay, so when we look at engineering measures, if you've put an engineering control down, for example, to, let's see here, you are working in heights, you're going to be working on scaffolding. So to ensure the scaffolding is safe, how do we go about doing that? We are going to install the tow guards. We are going to install the guardrails. We're going to install the access ladders and gates. We are going to ensure that we have a scaffold inspector who's competent and signs off the scaffold to say it is safe for access. Okay, maybe we need, depending on the height, maybe we need a safety harness and fall protection equipment. Okay, those are examples of engineering measures. Okay, they're going to protect you, okay, and minimize your exposure to the risks of falling from the scaffold. Okay, operational measures. Now, this comes down to the training, the competency, the procedures the company has in place to assist in minimizing your exposure to the hazard and the risks. Okay, so if you're working in heights, we need to ensure the employees working in heights have working in heights training, HSC training. Okay, do we have a safe operating procedure that talks about working in heights and talks about what tools and equipment needs to take place and be used for the working in heights? Okay, and then lastly, managing supervision. This just ensures that the if we have this measure in place, this just ensures that the administration behind getting the job and the controls in place are followed. For example, are the correct PPE being used? For example, hand gloves. Are the hand gloves the correct hand gloves for using as spanners? Are the correct hand gloves being used for using a circular saw? Okay, if you are grinding, are the correct glasses being worn when grinding? Okay, it ensures that we do our administration is in place. So when you think about managing supervision, I would look at your PPE and your paperwork. Okay. Responsibility for the risk assessment process. So who is responsible? Okay, it is the HSE rep and safety officers. They will initiate it. However, they cannot conduct it on their own. They need to work as a team with the construction manager and the construction supervisor. It does not happen in isolation. A team effort is required. If it is a small company, 2 individuals will be needing to do it, because on your risk assessment you will have 2 names. The person who is conducting the risk assessment and the person who has reviewed it and accepted it. Okay, you cannot be that person all on your own. Okay. So, that is the end of the theory. Okay, I've only focused on the most important pieces. The rest of it is in your textbook for you to review. So this is an example of a risk assessment and a layout of it. Very small screen grab that I've put here. For example, here, the hazard. Okay, here is the excavation. On the left, first heading in bold. The task or activity is my hazard, which is excavation. Okay, what are the risks involved? Pinch point. Okay, manual handling, falling into excavation, and potential confined space. Okay, so what are the consequences related to those risks? Okay, yeah, fingers placed in the wrong area. Okay, manual handling, insufficient manpower. You can get back injury. Falling into the excavation. Here, you can trip and fall, result in a concussion. Okay, you always need to list the consequences related to the risks. Okay, then you can see the initial risk score. Now, this is a different methodology I've used, and you can find the methodology I've used on the next slide. And here again, I stated that we can color code our risk levels. Okay, and you will always color code your revised risk score. So you will do your initial risk score, you'll put in your controls to minimize the exposure, and then you will redo another score to show that you've reduced your exposure to the risk. We always need to ensure that after we've put our controls in, we have a reduced risk exposure level. Okay. So this is the methodology we've used. Have a look. If you have any questions, let me know. But yeah, every company is different, and every company has their own methodology. You as the safety officer do have the responsibility to change the methodology, because there's always new ones, and whatever works for the industry you are working in. This one is mainly used in the construction industry. I use this a lot on the field terminals where our construction company works. Okay, that brings us to the end of the session. Hope you have a